What if one of America's greatest generals predicted exactly how the Cold War would unfold, but Washington refused to listen? General Douglas MacArthur saw threats that politicians dismissed as paranoia. He warned about strategies that would cost thousands of lives and billions of dollars. And when he spoke the uncomfortable truths that needed to be heard, they fired him for it. Today we're examining 15 warnings MacArthur gave about the Cold War that Washington ignored, and what happened when they learned he was right all along. Warning 1. China would become the real threat. While Washington focused obsessively on the Soviet Union, MacArthur saw a different danger emerging in the East. He warned repeatedly that China, with its massive population and strategic position, would become America's primary adversary in Asia within decades. MacArthur understood something that politicians in comfortable Washington offices didn't. Geography and demographics matter more than ideology in long-term strategic planning. He argued that containing China required immediate action, not the wishful thinking that the Chinese Communist Party would somehow moderate over time. His warnings were dismissed as the ramblings of an old soldier who didn't understand the nuances of diplomacy. The State Department assured everyone that China could be managed through careful engagement and that the Soviet Union was the only enemy that mattered. Decades later, as China emerged as America's primary strategic competitor, as supply chains became dependent on Chinese manufacturing, and as the South China Sea turned into a flashpoint for potential conflict, MacArthur's warnings echoed from the grave. He had seen it coming when everyone else was looking the other way. Warning 2. Limited war is unwinnable. MacArthur believed that the concept of limited war was fundamentally flawed and would lead to endless conflicts without resolution. He argued that if America was going to fight, it needed to fight to win decisively, not engage in half measures that would drag on for years. His position was clear. War is either worth fighting with full commitment or not worth fighting at all. The idea of calibrating military force to achieve political objectives while avoiding escalation seemed logical in theory, but disastrous in practice. Washington politicians loved the concept of limited war because it allowed them to avoid difficult decisions. They could appear tough without mobilizing the nation, could pursue military objectives without declaring war, and could maintain the illusion of control over conflicts that were spiraling beyond anyone's control. Korea dragged on. Vietnam became a quagmire. Afghanistan lasted 20 years. MacArthur had warned that fighting wars with one hand tied behind your back doesn't protect you from escalation. It just guarantees you'll lose slowly instead of winning quickly. But limited war became the American doctrine, and the results spoke for themselves. Warning 3. The danger of sanctuary areas. One of MacArthur's most specific warnings involved allowing enemies to maintain sanctuary areas where they could retreat, regroup, and resupply without fear of attack. He saw this as a fundamental strategic error that would prolong conflicts indefinitely. In Korea, he wanted to strike Chinese supply lines and staging areas in Manchuria. He argued that allowing the enemy a safe haven across the border meant American soldiers would face endless waves of fresh troops, while their own forces were worn down in a war of attrition. President Truman and his advisors rejected this approach, fearing it would expand the war and potentially trigger World War III. They believed that respecting certain boundaries would keep the conflict contained and demonstrate American restraint to the international community. But MacArthur understood what they didn't. The enemy doesn't reward your restraint, they exploit it. Vietnam saw the same pattern with Laos and Cambodia. Afghanistan dealt with Pakistan's tribal areas. Every time America fought with self-imposed geographical restrictions, enemies used sanctuary areas to bleed American forces slowly. MacArthur had told them exactly what would happen. Warning 4. Politicians shouldn't micromanage military operations. MacArthur strongly believed that civilian control of the military meant setting objectives and providing resources, not dictating tactical decisions from thousands of miles away. He warned that political micromanagement would lead to military disasters. He had seen too many situations where politicians who had never been in combat were making detailed decisions about troop movements, target selection, and operational timing based on polling data and diplomatic considerations rather than military necessity. His conflict with Washington wasn't about rejecting civilian authority. It was about the proper relationship between political goals and military means. He believed commanders in the field should have the freedom to achieve their objectives using their professional judgment, not by following detailed instructions from bureaucrats. The pattern he warned about became standard practice. Vietnam saw bombing halts timed for political purposes. Rules of engagement in later conflicts became so complex that soldiers needed lawyers to determine if they could return fire. MacArthur had predicted that turning war into a political performance would get people killed unnecessarily, and he was proven right again and again. Warning 5. The cost of indecision. MacArthur warned repeatedly about the strategic costs of indecision and the tendency of democracies to delay difficult choices until circumstances forced much harder decisions. He believed that clear early action prevented larger conflicts later. His experience taught him that enemies interpret hesitation as weakness and are emboldened by it. He argued that the time to confront aggression is at the beginning, when it's cheapest and easiest, not after it has gained momentum and legitimacy. Washington's approach was the opposite. Delay confrontation, seek diplomatic solutions, give adversaries off-ramps, and hope that problems would somehow resolve themselves or that international pressure would change behavior. But dictatorships don't operate on democratic timelines. While America held meetings and drafted position papers, adversaries were creating facts on the ground. From Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia, from the Middle East to the Pacific, the cost of indecision was paid in lost strategic positions, abandoned allies, and ultimately in American blood and treasure. MacArthur had warned them that you either pay the small price early or the enormous price later. Warning 6. The illusion of negotiating with dictators. One of MacArthur's most cynical but accurate warnings involved the futility of negotiating with totalitarian regimes that saw diplomacy as warfare by other means. He believed that Western-style negotiations assumed good faith that simply didn't exist. He argued that communist nations used negotiations to buy time, divide their opponents, and extract concessions while never intending to honor agreements that didn't serve their interests. For them, treaties were tactical tools, not sacred commitments. The diplomatic establishment was horrified by this view. They believed that patient engagement, confidence-building measures, and finding common ground could bridge any divide. They saw MacArthur as a warmonger who didn't understand the sophisticated art of diplomacy. History provided a clear verdict. From Korean armistice violations to Soviet treaty violations to countless broken promises across the Cold War, the pattern MacArthur predicted played out exactly as he said it would. Dictators used negotiations to achieve what they couldn't win militarily, then violated agreements the moment it suited them. But Washington kept believing that the next negotiation would be different. Warning 7. Europe's declining relevance in Asia. While most of Washington's Cold War strategy focused on Europe and NATO, MacArthur warned that the future of global power would be decided in Asia, not on the plains of Central Europe. He saw this as a fundamental strategic miscalculation. His argument was straightforward. Asia had the population, the resources, and the geographic scale that would determine who dominated the 21st century. Europe was yesterday's battlefield, Asia was tomorrow's. But European-focused politicians and generals couldn't imagine a world where Asia mattered more than Europe. The entire American military was organized around the idea that if war came, it would be a replay of World War II with tanks clashing in Germany. MacArthur's vision of an Asia-centric strategy was dismissed as regional bias from someone who had spent too much time in the Pacific. Decades later, as America pivoted to Asia, as China emerged as the primary competitor, and as European military capabilities atrophied into irrelevance, his warning seemed prophetic. The war he predicted never came in Europe, while Asia became the center of global competition exactly as he said it would. Warning 8. The danger of fighting without public support. MacArthur understood something fundamental about democracies at war. They cannot sustain long conflicts without clear public understanding and support. He warned that fighting wars that the American people didn't fully understand or endorse would end in failure. He believed that if a war was worth fighting, political leaders had a responsibility to explain why to the American people and mobilize national will. If they couldn't do that, they shouldn't fight the war at all. But the Cold War introduced a new phenomenon: undeclared wars, police actions, military advisors, and conflicts that happened in the shadows while Americans went about their normal lives. Politicians loved this because it avoided the political costs of mobilization. MacArthur's warning proved accurate in every subsequent conflict. Korea ended in stalemate partly because Americans never understood why they were fighting. Vietnam collapsed when public support evaporated. Even recent conflicts suffered from the absence of national commitment that comes with clearly defined purposes and honest engagement with the public about costs and risks. Warning 9. The myth of gradualism. MacArthur was skeptical of gradualist approaches to warfare, the idea that slowly escalating pressure would eventually force enemies to capitulate without requiring decisive action. He saw this as wishful thinking that would prolong wars unnecessarily. His military experience taught him that gradualism gave enemies time to adapt, to develop countermeasures, and to marshal their resources. It also sent a message of uncertainty and lack of resolve that emboldened resistance rather than crushing it. The strategic theorists in Washington loved gradualism because it seemed sophisticated and controllable. They believed they could turn military pressure up or down like a dial, carefully calibrating force to achieve political objectives without unnecessary escalation. Vietnam became the laboratory for testing gradualist theory, and it failed spectacularly. Years of carefully calibrated bombing campaigns accomplished what MacArthur predicted. They gave North Vietnam time to adapt, allowed them to portray America as an uncertain giant, and ultimately demonstrated that gradual escalation costs more in blood and treasure than decisive action would have. But by the time Washington learned this lesson, thousands were dead. Warning 10. Intelligence, over-reliance, and under-questioning. MacArthur warned about the tendency to rely too heavily on intelligence assessments while failing to question their assumptions and limitations. He believed commanders needed to maintain healthy skepticism about intelligence products. He had seen too many situations where intelligence agencies produced assessments that matched what policymakers wanted to hear rather than uncomfortable realities. He argued that confirmation bias infected intelligence work just like everything else in bureaucracies. Washington developed an almost religious faith in intelligence capabilities. If the CIA or military intelligence said something, it must be true. Questioning intelligence assessments was seen as anti-intellectual or dangerously dismissive of expert analysis. But MacArthur's warnings proved prescient. From wildly inaccurate assessments of communist strength in Vietnam, to the complete failure to predict the Soviet collapse, to the disastrous intelligence on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the pattern was clear. Intelligence agencies often got it wrong at critical moments. His warning to maintain skepticism and verify rather than simply trust was ignored, repeatedly, with disastrous consequences. Warning. 11. The problem with coalition warfare. While everyone praised coalition warfare as demonstrating international legitimacy and burden sharing, MacArthur warned about its military drawbacks. He argued that coalitions complicated command structures, restricted operational flexibility, and often meant strategy was determined by the lowest common denominator. His concern wasn't political, it was practical. Every additional nation in a coalition meant another set of restrictions, another political consideration, another potential veto over military operations. It meant intelligence couldn't be fully shared and that operational security was compromised. The diplomatic and political establishment dismissed these concerns as the grumblings of someone who wanted total control. They believed that international coalitions were worth the operational complications because they demonstrated that America wasn't acting unilaterally. But military operations in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts demonstrated exactly what MacArthur predicted. Coalition partners imposed restrictions that prevented effective operations. Political considerations in other capitals delayed or vetoed military actions. The military benefits of coalition warfare rarely outweighed the operational costs, but admitting this meant questioning a foundational assumption of American diplomatic strategy. Warning 12. Underestimating Asian nationalism. MacArthur warned that Washington fundamentally misunderstood Asian nationalism and its power to motivate populations. He argued that Western politicians saw everything through an ideological lens, while missing the deeper currents of national identity and anti-colonial sentiment. He understood that for many Asians, communism was less important than independence from Western domination. Nationalist leaders might adopt communist rhetoric and accept Soviet support, but their primary motivation was national sovereignty, not Marxist ideology. The State Department's view was simpler. Communism was spreading in Asia, and it needed to be stopped. Whether nationalist sentiment was driving that spread or whether nationalism could be separated from communism weren't questions they spent much time considering. Vietnam became the catastrophic demonstration of MacArthur's warning. America fought for years without understanding that it was opposing Vietnamese nationalism as much as Vietnamese communism. The same pattern appeared across Asia. Viewing every conflict through a purely ideological lens meant missing the deeper forces at work. and MacArthur had told them this would happen. Warning 13. The danger of domestic political considerations driving military strategy. One of MacArthur's most bitter warnings involved the tendency of politicians to make military decisions based on domestic political considerations rather than strategic necessity. He believed this inverted the proper relationship between war and politics. He understood that war was an extension of politics, but he argued that once military force was committed, military considerations should drive operational decisions. Using battlefield actions to influence midterm elections or satisfy particular constituencies was, in his view, a betrayal of soldiers in the field. Washington saw this differently. Elections couldn't be suspended because there was a war on. Public opinion mattered. Political coalitions needed to be maintained. Military decisions couldn't be made in a political vacuum. But MacArthur's warning about the costs of this approach proved accurate. Bombing halts timed for political impact, troop withdrawals scheduled around election cycles, and strategies designed to minimize politically damaging footage rather than achieve military objectives all followed the pattern he predicted. Soldiers paid with their lives for decisions made to satisfy political constituencies back home. Warning 14. The impossibility of defending everywhere. MacArthur advocated for a clear strategic focus rather than attempting to defend every potential flashpoint globally. He warned that spreading American military power too thin would mean being strong nowhere and vulnerable everywhere. His approach was to identify vital interests, concentrate force to defend them decisively, and accept that some peripheral areas would have to be conceded or defended by other means. This required making hard choices about what truly mattered. The Cold War establishment rejected this approach. They developed a strategy of global containment that committed America to opposing communist expansion everywhere. This felt morally satisfying and strategically comprehensive, even if it was logistically impossible. The result was exactly what MacArthur predicted. American forces were scattered across the globe, responding to crises in marginal areas while lacking the concentrated power to decisively win any of them. From Korea to Vietnam to countless smaller interventions, America was strong enough to get involved everywhere, but not strong enough to decisively win anywhere. His warning about the strategic bankruptcy of defending everything went unheeded. Warning 15. The personal cost of truth-telling. Perhaps MacArthur's most prophetic warning wasn't about strategy, but about the fate of military leaders who tell uncomfortable truths to political leaders who don't want to hear them. He predicted that speaking honestly about military realities would cost him his command, and he was right. He understood that his warnings about China, about limited war, about the impossibility of victory under the restrictions Washington imposed would eventually lead to his dismissal. Politicians couldn't tolerate a military leader who publicly contradicted their policies and predictions. In April 1951, President Truman relieved MacArthur of command. The official reason was insubordination. But the real reason was that MacArthur kept being right about things that were politically inconvenient. He kept warning about consequences that politicians didn't want to acknowledge. His firing sent a message to every military leader who came after him. Keep your doubts private, tell politicians what they want to hear, and never publicly contradict policy, even when you know it will fail. The cost of MacArthur's truth-telling was his career, but the cost of the silence that followed was measured in decades of failed conflicts and thousands of American lives. He had warned them about all of it, and they fired him for being right too early. General Douglas MacArthur's warnings about the Cold War weren't the rantings of an out-of-touch commander. They were the insights of someone who understood strategic realities that politicians found inconvenient. From China's rise to the futility of limited war, from the dangers of sanctuary areas to the costs of political micromanagement, his predictions proved remarkably accurate. The tragedy isn't that he was ignored, it's that the patterns he identified continued for decades. American foreign policy repeated the same mistakes in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, learning and forgetting the lessons MacArthur tried to teach. His warnings remain relevant today as new conflicts emerge and old patterns repeat. Sometimes the hardest thing for leaders to do is listen to someone telling them what they don't want to hear. MacArthur paid the price for his honesty, but history has vindicated his warnings. The question is whether current and future leaders will finally learn the lessons he tried to teach, or whether we'll continue ignoring uncomfortable truths until they become undeniable disasters. If you found these insights valuable, Consider subscribing for more deep dives into the historical lessons that still shape our world today.